Thursday, January 27, 2011. Dinner and Learn, God of Our Understanding, Part 10.
This is our 10th class, and we're finally getting into the meat and potatoes of the book God of Our Understanding, Jewish Spirituality and Recovery from Addiction by Rabbi Shais Taub. Last week we discussed how there has to be a definition of God, a theological definition of God, in the 12 steps, because the 12 steps describe what type of God we're using as a means of recovery from addiction. And we identified 4 areas. There was, at the end of page 57, we said, based on the steps 3, 5, 6, and 11, and even 7 and 2, God has a power. He is a power. He can affect our lives. He is caring, and He has a will. So, over the next few chapters, we're going to read about the power of God, the goodness of God, the forbearance of God, and the will of God. And so this chapter 7 on page 59, is the power. The first allusion to God in the steps is found in step 2, where He is referred as a power greater than ourselves. And the word power in the 12 steps has a capital P. It is evident that we're not just talking about any power that happens to be stronger than we are, although we'll see that for some it's a first step. If that were so, then the recovering person might choose to believe that gravity or electromagnetism could restore his or her sanity. Those powers are greater than we are, because when we jump up, we fall down, because gravity is stronger than us. We certainly cannot defy their effects, but we also have no reason to believe that they can do anything for us other than blindly impose their influences as dictated by the laws of nature. So when I need a power greater than myself to do stuff for me, the stuff that I ask them to restore me to sanity, and in step 3, to turn my will and my life over to the care of God, so I'm asking for the care. In step 11, I ask for the will. So therefore, gravity has no will for me. Gravity has no power to restore me to sanity. So when we speak about power, that is the proper capitalized other than the common noun, we're talking about a force that transcends all other powers in the universe. Because the other powers in the universe are things that I'm using for my insanity. And when I want to restore myself to sanity, I'm looking for power greater than myself, but than ourselves, than the collective, humankind and the collective universe. Like the Zohar says, Master of the worlds, you are the highest of the high, the causers of causes. Maimonides talks about it in the opening of his monumental work on Jewish law. He starts with the sentence, God is the cause of all that exists. And there is no possibility that He does not exist, because without Him all existence will cease. Whereas if we could imagine the absence of all existence other than His, the existence of God will not cease or diminish, for He is self-sufficient, and His existence requires nothing other than Himself. Every existence in the world requires the existence of God, but God's existence does not require any other existence in the world in order for God to exist. So if God ceases to exist, the world ceases to exist. But if the world ceases to exist, God will not cease to exist. That's what I want to be said. So in other words, although the phrase power greater than ourselves may lend itself to being interpreted as any power, the effects of which are unavoidable, if read in the context of the rest of the steps, it is obvious that the power mentioned in step 2 is not the sun or the ocean tides, but the same God who is explicitly mentioned throughout. The God who restored sanity in step 2, who cares for the individual in step 3, who removes character defect in steps 5, 6, and 7, and who lets His will be known, and grants power to the individual to adhere to that will. In step 11, we ask God for the power to carry His will. So it means God has the power to give us, to grant us power has the capacity to grant us power to fulfill His will. Still more context will be of even greater help to us in understanding the power alluded in the second step. In the big book, just before the steps are first enumerated, this idea is stated unambiguously. Without help, and we read this sometimes at the beginning of meetings how it works, without help, it is too much for us. But there is one, capital O, who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now, capital H. Clearly, when step 2 speaks of a power, it does not mean just any power. It means the one, quote unquote, it means God. So God, a power greater than itself means God, and soon we're going to understand why here, instead of saying the word God, it uses the word power with a capital P. Not just to mix it up a little bit, it has a very good meaning. Now, the question is, it doesn't say that we need that we came to believe that the power greater than ourselves can serve sanity. We say a power. So a power allows for picking one such power. And if power greater than ourselves means only God, then there is only one God. There is no many gods you can pick from. One might still ask, if this power is indeed singular and unique, if it is none other than the power behind all the powers, then why is it referred only as a power and not the power? Perhaps the following story will prove illuminating. A well-known old-timey Kansiai talks about his early experiences grappling with belief. He related he told his sponsor that he could not believe in God. His sponsor asked him whether he could believe in the concept of God and just not the word God. The sponsor asked him whether he could believe in the power of the AA group. Nope. Finally, the sponsor asked him, can you admit that I am doing better than you? Because the sponsor was not drinking, and Clancy was. So Clancy said, sure. So his sponsor told him, congratulations, kid. You've just met your new higher power. He said, I'm your sponsor, and I will be your higher power. More telling than the story itself is its epilogue. Years later, Clancy's sponsor stopped working the program, number 1, by the way, got drunk, number 2, and died, number 3. What was Clancy to do now? What with his higher power being dead and all? Would he lose his direction? His faith? Not at all, because Clancy explains that by the time he lost his sponsor, Clancy already believed in God, the real God, the big God. A power greater than himself, not the power, not just A. It was his belief in his sponsor as a power greater than himself that was necessary first to move away from self-reliance. This is the key word over here. And we'll see a little more about it later, which is why step 2 comes as a continuation for step 1. And we always say in the program, you never, actually just yesterday I was talking to someone on the phone and says, yeah, I have a problem with step 2. And you don't have a problem with step 2? No one has a problem with step 2. No one has a problem with step 5. Everyone has a problem with step 1. Step 1 is that I'm powerless. And we'll see how that feeds into step 2, where we seek for a power greater than himself. Once he was able to accept his dependence upon something outside of his own ego, he had already begun his journey towards finding God. In other words, it is most probably safe to say that a person can get sober or work an effective second step just by believing in any power. Sure, that's a good beginning. Indeed, it is often the case that belief in a higher power, any higher power, is that which marks the nascent beginnings of a process towards discovering the highest power. So now we have a higher power, and we'll have the highest power. And like we said last week, the guy who believes that the door handle is his higher power. So it is the highest power that is referred to explicitly in the following steps, which comes right out and unambiguously invoke the word God. Therefore, while step 2 does not tell us that we need to believe in God per se, most certainly begins to lead us in that direction. And here is a story with a woman who used to talk to an oak tree outside of her window because she couldn't believe in God, and she was able to talk to relate to the oak tree that was much bigger than her. And one day she moved. She moved out of her house, and the oak tree didn't come with her, but she said God did come with me. Because by that she started with the oak tree. But that was just her first step away from self-reliance. Once she was able to realize that there's something outside of her that was bigger than her and bigger than her desire or her need for control, that she was able to eventually grow into a belief in God. The point of this story is not to endorse hero worship or animism. Animism means the belief that a stone or a tree has divine powers. And that's idolatry. So, God forbid to say that hero worship, as I worship a sponsor or a tree, should be a stepping stone to belief in God. The author is merely trying to point out is that for all of us, belief is a process. Even those who do believe in God, as we grow, our belief in God graduates with us. Our belief in God changes as we grow in our spirituality and have a better relationship with Him. So all of us start somewhere lower than the highest, and through our life, slowly, and sometimes we reach the highest and sometimes we don't. So for some people, the beginning is just a drop before that. For some, it begins by making only the smallest possible concessions that the rational mind can bear. But if one is honest and one continues seeking, one will find true faith in the end. And basically, actually, this is how faith was achieved in the first place. The first person who believed in God was Abraham. And Abraham did not come to believe in God at the first try. God, the Medrash tells us the story of Abraham, and Maimonides brings it down to the laws of concerning the prohibition of idolatry, and I'm reading from the top, page 62. Abraham was but a small child when his mind began to seek and wonder, how do the heavenly bodies orbit without a moving force? Who moves them? They cannot move themselves. His heart sought and then came to know that there is but one God who created all, and that in all existence there is none other than He. And the Medrash tells us in the beginning he thought the sun was God because the sun warmed up all the earth, and then but now when the sun left, he thought maybe the moon was God because the moon pushed away the sun, etc., etc. So Abraham did not come to, the first thing he knew that, there has to be a God. But he didn't understand yet, he didn't realize that God is the greatest power of all. He just knew that God was something more powerful than he is, more powerful than the sun, more powerful than the moon. And eventually he arrived to the faith. It's a faith that came as a result of trying out different ways to find this power within himself. Abraham discovered believing in one God through a process of looking further and further outside of himself until arriving at the causer of causes. When we begin to look beyond our ego, we have already begun our journey to find God. The unfortunate fact of the matter, however, is that many of us stop short in our quest. We find belief in something beyond ourselves and rest on our spiritual laurels. In recovery, however, one does not have the luxury of spiritual stagnation. One's faith must continuously grow. Certainly, for a Jew, the belief in the highest power, and not just any power, is essential for faith. We may begin like Abraham by searching somewhere out there, anywhere beyond the self, but we must always arrive at the realization that ultimately there is one who has all power, and that one is God, and that's again a quote from the Big Book. So, basically, others have the luxury. People who are not in recovery have the luxury to speculate and philosophize about what God is and what God is not. But for a person in recovery, eventually our recovery has to continue growing until it reaches a place where we can believe in a God that is causer of all causes, an omnipotent God, one that has the power to do everything. Like in the Big Book it says, either God is everything or He is not. That's the God that we are trying to achieve, not the God who is the handle or the group or the sponsor or the trio, the oak tree. We need to find a power that is more powerful than anything. And this is only possible if we do a proper first step. This idea of looking for power beyond one's ego is the content of step 1, in which the addict admits his or her own powerlessness. Thus, in a very important way, the process of finding God as highest power subtly begins before step 2, has even introduced the notion of a higher power. In other words, before we can begin to honestly look for God as a power, we have to admit our own limitations. It's often said in the recovery circles, there is a God, and you not it. It might be useful to know that Chassidut teaches that the opposite of serving God is not idolatry, but the service of self. This is very important in understanding recovery and in understanding the concept of God. A lot of times in recovery, we look for the opposite of a character defect. That will be a character asset. When I live in the opposite of the character defects, I am living in my recovery. A lot of times it's hard for us to define something. We look for the opposite. But a lot of people think that the opposite of believing in God is believing in a tree, or believing in the Son of God, or believing in multiple gods. Chassidus says the biggest impediment, and therefore the contradiction and the opposite of believing in God, is believing in oneself as the ultimate God. At least idolaters turn to an entity outside of themselves, whereas the egomaniacs and addicts, almost by definition, fit that profile, cannot peacefully, because sometimes we have to because we don't have a choice, but we cannot peacefully defer to anyone or anything aside from our own ego. Thus, the mental shift that is most critical and urgent is that of the addict's adherence to the simple piece of advice often heard in the rooms: get out of your own head. It's lonely and it's unsafe. The Talmud relates that God says of an arrogant person, it is impossible for him and me to dwell in the same place. Although God is omnipresent, his presence cannot be felt. So yes, it's there obviously, but the expression of that existence cannot be felt where there is haughtiness and pride. Haughtiness and pride. To allow the power of God into one's life, one must first acquiesce to the fact of his or her own lack of power. Like the famous story with Mendel Kutzker. He was asked when he was a kid, where's God? He says, wherever you let him in. What does it mean you let him in? You make space for him. When someone knocks on your door and you say, come on in, sir, knock, knock. When you say, come on in, you have to open the door. If you don't open the door, then you can say, come in all day. The person cannot come in. So when we say, come on in, we have to make space. Well, usually that space is filled already with something. It's filled with our ego. And the presence of God in our lives is directly proportionate to the lack of ego in our lives. The more space more room we make by moving our ego out of the way, the more room there is for God to come in. This is it's actually, once we move ourselves away, there is even no need to bring in God. God almost automatically comes in, just like a vacuum. That when we take the air out of the chamber, in the syringe, for example, the blood is automatically drawn into it. We don't have to make room and then bring it in. It's really an automatic process that starts with me going out of the way and continues with making space for God and God coming in. In other words, God will always fill whatever space we make for Him, but He will not intrude where He is clearly unwelcome. In order to experience God's power in step 2, one first make a power vacuum in step 1. The recognition of the limits of personal power sets the scene for entering into a relationship with that which is unlimited. Now the question is, why is God called power specifically in this step? If in step 1 you become ready to meet God, in step 2 you actually meet Him. Well, why does the first reference to God in the steps allude to Him as power? So we can say that the word God is scary, or we can say another answer is because step 1 is saying that I'm powerless, so now I need a power. But the author says there seems to be more into it than that, and I'm at the bottom of page 63. There's a saying in recovery: don't tell God how big your addiction is. Tell your addiction how big your God is, or how big God is. The disease of addiction, regardless of drug of choice, which means it's applicable to both substance addiction and process addiction, is essentially an obsession with power. And a lot of people think that people drink because they want to be out of control. Absolutely not. People drink and use drugs because they know exactly how it's going to feel after the consumption of that drug of choice, after that gamble, or after that food, or whatever it is that a person is addicted to. That is because I seek control in my life, and when I don't drink, I don't know how my life will be. When I drink, I know exactly what's going to happen. So the addiction is driven by a desire and a need to be in power and in control. The addict wants control and finds it in the altering of his or her state by indulging in addictive behavior. Hence, in order to recover, the addict must surrender his desire for control. So now I have something that I know very well how to do, in my mind at least, because in other people's mind I lost control a long time ago, but at least in my mind I'm in control of this situation. And now I'm saying, you can't control it, you're not. So who is going to control it now? Who should I give it over to? To someone who has the capacity, the same capacity as my perceived capacity of controlling my life in a way that is consistent with good controllers. So who should I give it over to? My mother? To my father? To my brother? To my sister? To my sponsor? Who is it that I'm willing to give over this baton of power that I've been holding for so long? Who am I going to give it over to? Okay, so we're told to give it to God, but who is this God? The likelihood on top of page 64 that surrender will be effective as a means for treating addiction depends entirely on one's comfort with God. I think that God is a weakling. I can't recover. I'm not comfortable. I don't feel safe. Simply put, the idea that God can heal the addict only seems true if the God of one's conception is a God to whom one can worthily surrender one's own power. God may be things to many people, but for the recovering addict, God must before all else be power. Indeed, this may be the reason that the practice of religion by itself is usually inadequate in treating addiction. How do we know? Because we know many religious people who are truly religious, following all the precepts of the Torah or whatever other religion they're following, and they're still addicts who are actively using that cannot stop. Why? Because one can believe in God and really practice some form of devotion to Him. Not only religion, but even devotion. But if one does not come to believe in God as power, then there's nothing to which the addict can surrender control. Who should I give it to? While there are many religions and belief systems that view God as the archetype of many such abstractions as love, wisdom, and peace, in recovery, God is the quintessence of power and is introduced as such even before he was with. In recovery, God needs to be a powerful God. Someone that's reliable. The medieval Jewish philosopher Yehuda Halevi explains in the Kuzari why the first commandment of the Decalogue, also known as the Ten Commandments for us simple people, states, I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. And we discussed many times, the question is, why does it say, I am the Lord your God who created the world? That's much bigger. In the resume, it looks much more impressive that somebody created a world, something out of nothing, than to say that someone took the Jewish people out of Egypt. Halevi answers that God chose to introduce himself in the way that would be most relevant to those of whom he was addressing. The concept of creation seems too abstract, there we say too impersonal, to serve as the basis of a relationship. The Exodus, on the other hand, demonstrates God's direct involvement in the affairs of man. When somebody is looking to get married, and he's looking for a relationship, he doesn't bring his degree from Harvard. He has to demonstrate qualities of a person who's good in the relationship. If it's a male, then he wants to show that he'll be able to provide for his family, that he's going to be present physically and emotionally, etc. That's what the female is looking for in a husband. She's not looking at what type of degree he has. How is that going to help her in her marriage? If she's going to commit herself into a relationship where her life will be dependent on this other person, well, she wants to know that this other person has qualities and credentials that make him a good person to be dependent on. Maybe not totally dependent, but codependent in a good way. So saying, be in a relationship with me because I created the world, says it means nothing to the Jewish people. Be in a relationship with me because I take care of you. I just took care of you lately by taking you out of Egypt, by splitting the Red Sea for you, by giving you manna, by providing you with water. Now that's somebody that I want to be in a relationship with. That's someone reliable. That's someone I can count on. In other words, the Jewish relationship with God is not predicated upon God's role as creator, but as power. And the author talks about a story with a young man who believed his concept of a higher power was compassionate, just, and wise. And the rabbi pointed out to him that if he wants a higher power, then his higher power needs also to be powerful. Kabbalah says that when God created the world, because it was something out of nothing, he or it cannot leave the world, because if God leaves the world will cease to exist. In other words, the easiest way for God to destroy the universe that he created was not going to be through a flood, through fire, but by doing nothing. If God does nothing, the world will cease to exist. It means that God is present every single day, every single moment, every single place in the universe. God's presence is there to make the world exist. And without this constant imposition, all of creation will revert to nothingness. As such, there is no automatic pilot. God is always in control. In the lingo of recovery, nothing, absolutely nothing, happens in God's world by mistake, and that is because God is there to make sure that it does not happen by mistake. Or like they say in recovery, if God is your co-pilot, switch seats. I'll go. Well, so basically, Here we find that it's not enough for a God to be compassionate, just, and wise. Because if God does not have ways to share with me His compassion, to share with me His wisdom, to share with me His justice, then the fact that He has all these qualities become meaningless to me. So sure, I want the guy with all the capacities, all the qualities, but I want someone that relates to me, that will be able to move in with me. Oh, I have a great husband for you. He lives in Australia. He has all the good qualities in the world. He has only one problem. He's scared to go on a plane. And he won't travel by ship. So, I have what's wrong with him? He's perfect. He has all the good qualities for a perfect husband. He's just not available. He doesn't have a way to come and exercise his qualities in a way that will be useful for you. Thank you very much. I don't need it. God is not only enough that He's compassionate, just, and wise. He needs to be powerful so He can come and deliver the goods. And if He can't deliver the goods, He is of no help to me, the recovering addict. God cannot be an abstraction. We can describe Him with all the great and lofty terms we can think of. But if we cannot see Him as an active force in our lives, then we have not even begun to know what God is. My teacher, the Lubavitcher Rebbe of blessed memory, which is also my teacher, delivered most of his public addresses in Yiddish, but whenever he spoke in English, he would always refer to God with the somewhat unusual phrase, God Almighty. Though this was not a direct translation of the term for God that he most often used in his first language, which was the Eibishter, the one above. There's something telling about this. When we speak of God, particularly in a secular language lacking an adequate lexicon for divine concept, we must understand that God is power, that He is not just God, whatever that means to us, but God Almighty. He has the power to do it all, which is why I need God, and this is why I can use God in my life. I need a God who is perfect, who is powerful, who is available, who has no limitation, so that I can let go of my perceived control, and with no excuses. Well, it's okay for God to take control over my job, over my breathing, over my driving, but laundry? I don't know if God knows well how to separate colors and whites. What type of God is that? I can't give over my power to God if He doesn't go and do laundry. God Almighty is the God that I need in my life, a God that I can trust, a God that I can rely on with my perceived control of my life. When I have such a God, and I give my will and my life over to that type of God, I will relax. I don't have to be worried about everything anymore. And maybe my sanity.